It was just another night, or so it seemed. The flickering lights of the small town danced against the darkness of a starless sky as people wrapped up their daily routines. The TV in Daniel's apartment murmured irrelevant news, and the distant barking of dogs filled the silence. It was an ordinary night until it wasn't. At 9:03 p.m., a piercing sound ripped through the air, startling Daniel from his spot on the couch. The noise came from his phone, the television, and even the old radio sitting on the shelf. An emergency alert message blared across every screen and speaker at once. National Emergency Alert. All citizens must follow the instructions below. 1. Close all curtains and blinds immediately. 2. Do not open doors or windows under any circumstances. 3. Do not look outside. 4. Remain silent. 5. Further information will be provided shortly. Daniel's heart began to race. He grabbed his phone, scrolling frantically through social media for answers. Confusion and panic dominated the comments, but no one seemed to know what was happening. Is this some kind of test? He muttered to himself, frozen in place. His rational mind insisted it had to be a mistake, some false alarm. But then, as he glanced out the living room window, he saw something that made his stomach churn. The street, usually calm and quiet at this hour, was now completely deserted, except for a single figure standing motionless in the middle of the sidewalk. It was hard to make out details from that distance, but something about it felt off. Its movements were barely perceptible, like it was just waiting. Daniel quickly shut the curtains. His phone buzzed violently in his hand. Another notification lighting up the screen. Emergency alert. You have 30 seconds to close your curtains. This is not a test. He obeyed, rushing to close every window in his small apartment. As he pulled the curtain in the bedroom, he noticed another figure standing in the street, closer this time. It seemed to be staring straight at him, even through the glass and the curtain. Suddenly, his phone rang. An unknown number. Hesitant, Daniel answered. Before he could say a word, a deep, emotionless voice echoed on the other end. You haven't closed the bathroom curtain. Daniel froze. The phone slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. How could anyone know he'd left the bathroom curtain open? He sprinted toward the bathroom, stumbling in his haste, and saw the window. Just a sliver of the curtain was still open, allowing the glow of the streetlight to seep in. With trembling hands, he yanked the curtain shut. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. Who had called? Who was out there? He picked up his phone again, but the number that had called him was now marked as unknown. At that moment, a flood of notifications erupted. Social media, group chats. Everyone was sharing images and videos of people who hadn't followed the alert. Many seemed too curious for their own good. One video caught his attention, a live stream from a young man in another city. The guy was laughing, pointing his camera toward an open window. This has to be some kind of prank. Look, I'm fine. Nothing weird happening here. Then his face changed. He stopped laughing and stared intently at something outside. The camera shook, but the video was clear enough to capture his expression morphing into sheer terror. Suddenly, he began walking toward the window, as if in a trance. Just before he could reach it, the live stream cut out abruptly, plunging into silence. Daniel swallowed hard. Returning to his feed, he noticed other videos vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Someone or something was erasing them. The television in his living room flickered on its own, displaying the emergency alert once again. This time, the message had changed. Warning: do not trust what you hear or see. Stay isolated. Ensure all access points are secure. Daniel began to hear noises from upstairs. It was coming from Mrs. Ruth's apartment, an 80-year-old widow who lived alone. The sound of hurried footsteps was completely out of character for someone her age. He moved closer to his front door, straining to hear. That's when he noticed another noise, a whisper. He couldn't make out the words, but it was repetitive, almost like a song or a chant. He stepped back to the center of the room, fighting the overwhelming urge to open the door and check what was happening. That's when his phone buzzed again, another message lighting up the screen. It's not her. Do not open the door. A sharp knock echoed through his apartment, as though someone was pounding against the metal. Daniel gripped his phone tightly, frozen in place. Daniel, are you there? Ruth's voice sounded dragged and deep, almost distorted. Help me. I'm stuck. He knew he should ignore it, but guilt clawed at his mind. What if she really was in danger? What if the alert was just an elaborate hoax? The sound of shattering glass snapped him out of his thoughts. His head whipped toward the bathroom. Even though the curtain had been closed, something had managed to break through it. His eyes widened as a shadow began to form behind the now torn curtain. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and it didn't belong there. The pounding on the door grew more violent. Daniel, you can't leave me out here. You can't. The voice was increasingly off, like someone trying and failing to imitate Ruth. He sank to the floor, leaning against the wall, his eyes locked on the door. Whatever was outside, or whoever, knew exactly how to manipulate him. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving Daniel's apartment in an almost deafening silence. He struggled to steady his breathing, but each inhale felt louder than the pounding of his own thoughts. In the bathroom, the silhouette behind the shredded curtain seemed to writhe and twist. Its exact form was impossible to make out. Whatever was hovered between something vaguely human and something far from it. His phone buzzed again, nearly slipping from his trembling hand. A new message appeared on the screen. Don't look directly. Stay away from the window. Before he could react, a low, scraping sound came from the kitchen, followed by unmistakable, light footsteps. The apartment was locked. There was no way anyone or anything could have gotten inside without him noticing. Daniel didn't want to believe it, but reality was unraveling before his eyes. He scanned the room, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Slowly, he crept toward the kitchen, grabbing one of the dumbbells near the door as a makeshift weapon. The footsteps stopped, and silence fell over the apartment once again. But as Daniel peeked around the corner, what he saw made his throat tighten. The kitchen window curtain, which he was absolutely certain he'd closed, was now wide open. Outside, standing on the sidewalk under the streetlight, was a figure staring straight at him. It was hard to pinpoint what made the figure so unsettling. Maybe it was the way it stood perfectly still, or perhaps it was a complete lack of facial features, as though it were nothing more than a solid shadow. Daniel immediately looked away, remembering the warning, "Don't look directly." He rushed to close the curtain again, but just as he reached for it, he noticed something even more horrifying. The figure was no longer on the sidewalk. Before he could react, he felt a faint breeze behind him. Something or someone was inside the apartment. He spun around, gripping the weight tightly as if bracing for an attack. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty, suffocating space. And then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the hallway, like someone whispering directly into his mind. The words were fragmented, nonsensical, but they carried a chilling, primal rawness. "Daniel, do you see? Do you understand?" His phone buzzed again in his hand, making him flinch. This time, the message was short and unsettlingly direct. "Don't respond." His thoughts were a chaotic blur. He moved on autopilot, retreating to the living room. But even that space had changed. The lights were dimmer, flickering faintly, and the shadow beneath the front door had grown larger, as if something on the other side was covering the entire entrance. A knock shattered the fragile silence. This time, it wasn't Ruth. The voice that followed was cold, mechanical, and unmistakably feminine. "Daniel, can we come in now?" His grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. There was no way to answer, no way out, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he realized what he was truly feeling. It wasn't just fear, it was a crushing certainty that something was waiting for him to make one wrong move. Daniel didn't answer the voice on the other side of the door, but his body was frozen in fear. The silence that followed was even worse than the question itself, as if the very air was waiting for his response. He took a step back, but felt something behind him. The familiar weight of the wall wasn't there. Slowly, he turned around and realized that the hallway, where his living room used to be, had changed. The walls seemed distorted and narrower, and the doors to the bedrooms and bathroom were ajar, offering only a partial glimpse of what lay beyond. Each door seemed to lead somewhere different, but none of them felt familiar. The phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the screen with trembling fingers. The message was different this time. "The doors are testing you. Choose carefully." Daniel tried to stay calm, but his mind was on the verge of breaking. Testing him? How? And what was behind each door? He had no choice. The hallway lights began to flicker, and knocking started. This time from all the doors at once. He hesitantly approached the first door, the one that should lead to his bedroom. When he pushed it open, the sight made him recoil. It was a perfect copy of his living room, but something was wrong. Everything was mirrored, as though someone had flipped the space. And sitting on the sofa was a man who was him. Or almost. The figure slowly raised its head and smiled. The teeth were too big, almost fake. The eyes, completely black. "You're taking too long, Daniel. This is giving us time." Daniel slammed the door shut before hearing the rest of the sentence, his heart racing uncontrollably. He tried to catch his breath, but the knocking continued, as if mocking his hesitation. He moved to the second door. This one led to the bathroom. He pushed it open harder than he meant to and saw something even worse. A giant mirror dominated the opposite wall, reflecting the same bathroom he was in but without him. The mirror showed the empty space, as if he didn't exist in that reflection, just a dark blur where he should have been. Before he could close the door, the blur began to move. Slowly, it gained shape, transforming into something humanoid but grotesque, with long, twisted arms. He slammed the door shut and backed away, trying to ignore the scratches that began appearing on the wood surface. There was only the last door left, the guest bedroom. He hesitated but knew time was running out. The lights in the hallway flickered faster, and the knocking on the front door grew more insistent. When he opened the last door, he found complete darkness. No sound, no movement, just emptiness. But then, something glimmered in the darkness, a pair of eyes cold and intense. They were watching, waiting for him. The phone vibrated one last time. Don't trust the eyes? Before he could comprehend, the eyes began to draw closer, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the darkness. He backed away and slammed the door shut. The knocking on the front door stopped. The lights returned to normal, and the hallway seemed to return to its original form. But something was different. He could feel it, like something had crossed over to the other side. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel managed to pull away from the doors. His body trembled, and each step felt like a fight against gravity. The hallway had returned to normal, but he knew this wasn't a sign of safety. He stared at the front door for a long moment, waiting for any sign of the knocking or the figure that seemed to be lurking outside. When nothing happened, he looked at the phone in his hand. The screen displayed a new message. "They've entered." Entered? Daniel spun around quickly, scanning every corner of the apartment. Everything seemed intact, but the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. The feeling of being watched followed him like a shadow. With hesitant steps, he walked into the kitchen. The lights flickered slightly, but remained on. He opened a drawer and grabbed a knife, trying to convince himself that this was some form of protection. Protection from what? he whispered to himself, his voice trembling with the question. The phone buzzed again, and the message was simple. Don't turn around. Daniel froze. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop suddenly, and he felt the weight of something behind him. It wasn't imagined. He could hear a heavy, irregular breath. Can you see us, Daniel? The voice didn't come from just one place. It was as if it were in every corner of the kitchen, whispering at once. He tried not to move, gripping the knife tightly, his knuckles white with tension. The phone vibrated once more. He looked at the screen reluctantly, unsure if he even wanted to read the message. Eyes closed. Go to the bedroom. He wasn't sure if he could trust those instructions, but something inside him told him that this was his only chance. With his eyes shut, he started to move. The footsteps behind him followed every move, so close he could feel the floor vibrating faintly. Sometimes, he heard something brush against the walls, like claws scratching the surface. When he reached the bedroom door, he extended his hand to find the doorknob. But before he could turn it, he felt something touch his shoulder. It was cold, and it felt like a hand, but the fingers were too long, almost wrapping around his arm. Are you going to open the door? The voice sounded both curious and predatory. Daniel twisted the doorknob and threw himself inside, slamming the door shut behind him. He opened his eyes. The room was empty, but something was wrong. The curtains were open, and the moonlight lit the space. He rushed to close them, but stopped halfway. On the other side of the window, he saw his reflection. At least, he thought it was. The figure on the other side was staring at him, but it wasn't a perfect reflection. It smiled first, and he didn't. Then it raised a hand and started to tap on the glass. Not from the inside out, but from the outside, trying to get in. Daniel stumbled back, feeling the floor beneath his feet turn into a prison. The sound of the tapping on the window was rhythmic and hypnotic, and the figure on the other side smiled wider and wider, an unnatural grin that seemed to tear its face apart. The phone vibrated in his hand, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to look away from the window. He instinctively knew that if he lost focus for even a second, something terrible would happen. With a shaky motion, he lifted the phone to read the message. Don't look in the eyes, but it was too late. The figure tilted its head grotesquely, and its eyes met Daniel's. In that instant, a biting cold gripped him, as if his body were being dragged into another dimension, where time and space were unrecognizable. He was standing in an empty field, shrouded in dense fog. There was no sound, except for a constant murmur that seemed to come from all directions. Daniel tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. Daniel, the sound of his name echoed in the air. He turned to find its source, but all he saw was a figure from the window, now standing just a few feet away. It wasn't just a distorted reflection. It was a version of himself, but terribly wrong. You shouldn't have looked. The voice was a mix of his own and something much darker. The thing took a step forward, and Daniel tried to back away, but realized his feet were stuck to the ground, as if roots were growing from his flesh. The phone vibrated again in his hand, but now he didn't know where it was coming from. The figure stretched out its hand, and the device appeared magically in its palm. It looked at the screen and smiled. They already know where you are. Daniel felt the field start to crumble around him. The murmur turned into screams, and suddenly, he was thrown back into his bedroom. He hit the floor, sweating and gasping for air, but the room was no longer the same. The walls were covered with symbols that glowed with a pulsating light. The curtains were torn, and the window displayed an absolute emptiness, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. The phone vibrated one last time. Daniel raised the screen, now nearly out of strength. Time to choose, stay or run. Before he could process what that meant, the figure appeared again, now inside the room. Staying is accepting, running is fighting. You decide, but choose wisely. Daniel knew time was running out. He looked at the knife in his hand, at the figure in front of him, and at the bedroom door. Whatever he chose, there was no guarantee of survival. He took a deep breath and made his decision. The silence in the room was deafening. Daniel knew that every second of hesitation brought him closer to the worst possible outcome. He felt the weight of the figure's gaze, which, despite being motionless, seemed to be in every corner of the room. The phone vibrated in his hand again, but this time, he didn't look. He already knew what it said. His options were clear, but what they truly meant was still a mystery. Stay or run, he murmured to himself, trying to calm his heart that was beating so fast it felt like it might burst from his chest. The figure tilted its head, an almost childlike gesture, but one that only made its presence more unsettling. You know what you have to do, Daniel. The choice isn't hard. He glanced at the knife in his hand. The words stay and run echoed in his mind like a chaotic mantra. Staying meant accepting whatever that entity was and its distorted reality. Running might just lead to an endless fight against something he barely understood. He decided he couldn't be passive anymore. Running would be his choice. With a quick movement, Daniel lunged toward the door of the room, but before he could reach it, he felt the air become dense, as if he were sinking into water. The figure appeared in front of him, blocking his path. You can't run. Here. Choices are illusions. Daniel screamed in frustration and pain, trying to push through that barrier. He swung the knife, but instead of meeting resistance, the blade passed through the figure as if it were made of shadow. If my choices are illusions, then I'll make my own rules, he shouted. With a desperate impulse, he turned the knife toward himself. Maybe, he thought, death was the only real way out. The room collapsed around him. The walls shattered into thousands of pieces, revealing an infinite void. Daniel felt like he was falling, but he never reached the ground. The figure watched him as he plummeted, that distorted smile never fading. Brave, but that doesn't mean you're free. Daniel opened his eyes. He was back on the living room couch, the phone still in his hand. The TV was off, the lights were on, and the curtains were drawn once more. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream, but the phone vibrated in his hand. He looked at the screen, his heart heavy with dread. You made your choice. Now, we watch. Outside, the sounds of footsteps began again, and shadows gathered under the streetlights. He knew that, even if he had escaped this time, it would never fully go away. He would never be alone again.